The Experience of Thinking. A series of talks on change of consciousness in the writings of European philosophers by John Thompson. Episode 5. Bacon, Descartes, Spinoza.
Today we move on to 17th century. So it's a very different time from the time of Thomas Aquinas and before that the Greeks. Remind you of the poem Ithaca. So you've got to take it all in. Take in the Cyclops, take in the Stygians, take them in. And then he says, unless you bring them along inside your soul, unless you bring them along up in front of you, you won't encounter them. So now you've got Thomas Aquinas in your soul and you've got Plato in your soul. We're going to now have Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and Spinoza today. Three heroes. So I don't know how to manage it, but they are an ensemble in a very strange way. They're very different. English, French, brought up in Holland. But I want to try and present something of these. Before we do that, just remember Thomas Aquinas. At the end of his life, he died very young, about 50, 51. He had we would call a stroke, maybe. I don't know what it was, but it was described at the time as if he was in ecstasy. Now, I'm not sure that's the same as a stroke, but what it means, and then he never spoke after that. He survived, I think, several months after that. But he wrote down that, and having written all these vast tomes on philosophy and on theology and so on, and all these many books, he said, such secrets have been revealed to me that all I have written appears as straw. So there you are. He's had an experience in that time, that just before he died. We know no more about that. Just to maybe give a picture of that period that's coming to a close, Dante wrote his poem 20 years after the death of Thomas. Dante wrote his poem in the year about 1300. And in that he goes on a journey. Not to Ithaca, but he goes on a vast journey, guided by his poet Virgil, down through the center of the earth into hell, right through hell, and right through to the other side, to the Mount of Purgatory. And there he ascends the Mount of Purgatory, and he climbs through all the spiritual spheres of the moon and the sun, and planets and so on, up to the highest empyrean. And right at the end of the Paradiso, he describes his experience. This is a translation of near the end of the Paradiso. O grace abounding, wherein I presumed to fix my look on the eternal light, so long that I consumed my sight thereon. He blinded himself. Within its depths I saw ingathered, bound by love in one volume, the scattered leaves of all the universe. That's Dante's experience in 1300. And now, time moves on, and we come to the end of that medieval period, and this extraordinary awakening of a new youthful quality in Italy in the 15th century, the period we know as the Renaissance. So I'm not going to talk about that, but we have to go through that and realize there's a lot's happening in the European soul in the 15th and 16th century. The new art, culminating in Leonardo and Michelangelo and so on. New architecture, new philosophies, new politics, tremendously new changes in the whole political life of countries in Europe. New explorations. The whole world is opening up to the Europeans, America, the East, and so on. And also, of course, a new science. And that's gradually, Leonardo's already a scientist, but that's when we come to the 16th, 17th century, people like Galileo are now getting to grips with how to understand the material world. So that's happened. And then we come to the 17th century. And these three figures, well, I think their shadows go right into modern times because they belong to our period, really. They are of our period. But they're also very different. Each one says he wants to found philosophy anew, start afresh. we can't go on the old ideas of Aristotle and the theologians of the Middle Ages. We have to found the whole thing anew. This one, Descartes and Spinoza. And I want to tell you briefly how they saw themselves founding things anew. Bacon was the lower nobility. He was brought up at the court of Queen Elizabeth I. He became a lawyer and entered Parliament at a very young age. We had a Parliament then, and he rose to power and became the Lord Chancellor, as he was called, and that was the chief advisor of the king. The king then was James I. So he had a supreme role in the government of England for several years. He was accused of corruption and brought to court. It was possible even then to bring Lord Chancellors to court. And he defended himself, saying that he accepted that he had received bribes. Yes, I've received bribes. I've never allowed them to interfere with my judgment. And so he was actually, the court condemned him, and he wasn't in prison, he wasn't fined, but then he retired and dedicated himself to writing and philosophy. His ambitions were vast. A book he wanted to complete, which was never completed, is called Instauratio Magna, the great renewal, the great new renewal of things. And in that book, which is parts of it which are eventually published, he wants to look at the whole question of how we've come to know the world and what it means, and every aspect that presents itself to him. That was his great work. But he had a very particular orientation. He was convinced that the old Aristotelian way of looking at the world was no longer valid. And he still uses some Aristotelian language. For example, when he talks about forms. Now remember, Aristotle had the idea of when you look at a plant, there's not only the physical material substance, but there's also form. It's not just the law of the plant, but it's something that's there embedded in the plant, which the intelligence can perceive, even if the senses can't. Now, form comes from Aristotle, simply means the law. He's looking for clear, defined laws of nature. So that's a very big step. Not even in Aquinas, who are also interested in the natural world, does it come in this way. He wants to know that which, and there's a way of getting these laws. And that is, quite clearly, that you have to, we'll talk about this later, and get rid of a whole lot of prejudices, but then you have to, first of all, proceed by experiment. Now, of course, the Middle Ages have done experiments, and even the Greeks in certain ways. But for Bacon, this becomes the central tool for understanding the world. You have to experiment. And then out of your experiments, you have a whole lot of data, and you put these together, and then you begin to formulate how things are. Once one does this, one acquires knowledge. But knowledge, what is knowledge for Bacon? Knowledge is power. He's not into the business of contemplating the world like the Greeks. And, of course, also, in a way, Aquinas, from a very different point of view. He's not in that. For him, knowledge is power. And so, by using this technique, we will acquire power over nature. I can't find where the quote comes from, but I remember reading that he said, we must put nature on a rack. Now, a rack is a torture machine, where you got the truth out of prisoners who wouldn't tell you the truth. So we must put nature on a rack, so that it reveals to us its secrets. And this next thing that is important for him is that he said, essentially, all these past thinkers have been working out of thoughts from which you deduce one thing from a previous thought. You take one thought and then you deduce it from that previous thought, you deduce a new thought, like you do in geometry. I don't know if you remember the theorems of Euclid and things like that, where you take a certain figure like a triangle, and then you define what you mean by triangle, and then out of that you deduce certain laws. You don't have to look at a triangle or measure it to do it. It's all out of the thinking. And that was, from Bacon, the old way of thinking. He said, my way of thinking is not like that. It's an inductive method. That means you look at the facts, you look at the particularities, and you gather from that where the system works. Very different. It's not simply evolving a world out of the thinking. So the inductive thinking becomes I wouldn't say exclusive, by no means exclusive, that the syllogism and deductive thinking is still valid for certain things. But for the research into the nature of the world around us, the inductive system is primary. And the other thing that he wanted to get rid of was these Aristotelians were looking at the world with what is the final cause of everything. You know, remember an example of a bronze statue. What's its final cause? It's to celebrate a god or to an athlete or something like that. It's got a purpose. Everything has a purpose. So not only if you look at a statue, but if you look at a tree, if you look at an animal, if you look at the human being, there you can find final cause. The human being became a very interesting question. But Bacon said, we get rid of final causes. Now maybe they may exist. For example, the purpose of the universe and think these more metaphysical questions, one may have that as a meaningful question, but in the search for the realities of nature, you don't ask what's the purpose of a fern or a rat or a lion or a human being. That is not a valid question. All that the causes, therefore, become what Aristotle called efficient causes. What brings that about? The final cause for Aristotle was, what was the purpose? So there are big changes. He wants to change the way of thinking. The other thing is, it's very important, is that he does speak about the nature of the divine, the nature of the spiritual world. He's not an atheist by any means, but he wants to leave aside all metaphysical questions and focus his attention on understanding the material world. So without being an atheist by any means, and of course that was not acceptable in any case in those days, but that's not in Bacon's world picture at all. But his drive, his real impulse is to get to grips with this material world and grasp it in such a way that you extend human power. Theological questions, metaphysical questions, he leaves aside. So you can see that he creates an impulse which goes on right into our own time, that the real knowledge is done through experimentation, through gathering together all sorts of details, through inductive reasoning, coming to general laws, and then seeing how these laws apply so that all that surrounds us here, our lights and the way we make chairs and everything, is a consequence of this drive in Bacon to turn knowledge from a contemplative exercise to a practical exercise with very definite ends. One of the books that was going to be part of this great renewal, he called the Novum Organum. Now, Aristotle has a book called the Organon, which is his book on logic. Organon means a kind of instrument, a kind of tool that enables you to turn it to any other aspect of the universe you try to understand. You must have the right tools. Aristotle's Organon was this tool of logic. Bacon writes a Novum Organum. It's quite a hefty book, but I'll just give you 1 or 2 points out of it. In this new instrument, he said, there are 4 idols, I-D-O-L-S, idols. You know what an idol is, something you worship. There are 4 idols. And if you want to search for the truth, then you've got to get rid of these 4 idols. And the first one is the idol of the tribe. What's the idol of the tribe? Well, that's all those ideas that we carry around with us in our language, in our customs, in our feelings also, the things we like, we believe things we like and we disbelieve things we don't like, that sort of thing. You've got to eliminate all these from your consciousness. You can't understand the world while you still carry around the idols of the tribe. And we all have idols of the tribe. That means all the things we like to believe, actually, without having accepted them or investigated them. And we also interpret the world anthropomorphically. That means we give to things in the world, especially God, a human expression. God has feelings. God has acts. God has thoughts. This is an anthropomorphic projection onto the universe, and that's part of the idol of the tribe. So eliminate that. The next one is the idol of the den. Now we're all it reminds you of Plato's den. But what's the idol of the den? We're all living in our little den, and each one has its own den, and from our little den we see the world with our particular temperament, our particular experience, our particular memories, our particular hopes and intentions, and these, of course, colour the way we understand the world. So that's another idol that you've got to get rid of. And the next one is the idol of the marketplace. That's due to the influence especially of language. We use words for which there is no corresponding thing. Let's go back into the 20th century philosophy already. For example, primum mobile was a phrase used by the medievals that meant the first mover, that is what's beyond the fixed stars, which sets the whole starry configuration into movement. Now, he says there's no corresponding thing for primum mobile. Get rid of it. That's the marketplace, what people just talk about, you know? It's just talk. And things like fortuna, fortune, that's just talk. There's no corresponding reality. You can say, that's what I mean. Get rid of it. It keeps you from knowledge. And the last one is the theatre, the idol of the theatre. You've got to get rid of that. Now, what's theatre? Well, the idol of the theatre is all those philosophical systems of the past that you've imposed on the world and think it's like looking at a theatre. There it is, Thomas Aquinas' theatre. That's his world, or Plato's world, or whoever, Occam's world. These are just like theatres. They're giving you a stage performance and you're living in it, but that's not the real world. Get rid of it. So he's trying to, apparently, undermine a whole lot of conceptions that were very, of course, prevalent then and, of course, prevalent today in the human psyche. And only after one's got rid of these can one really start the serious question of how to grasp the world with understanding. He said there are three false philosophies. Aristotle corrupted philosophy with his dialectic. That's this arriving at truth through argument. The empirical philosophers, with its limited and obscure observations. There were actually scientists contemporary with Bacon at the court of Elizabeth. One of them was William Gilbert. Now, he began to investigate the magnetism and static electricity. The first one to undertake this an interesting phenomenon. Let's try and understand it. Bacon was rather contemptuous about William Gilbert, and he felt they were making obscure things. It wasn't for him clear enough. So he dismissed Gilbert. But as you know, Gilbert's original investigations are the beginning of our electronic world, and where would we be without it? And then there are the superstitious philosophers we must get rid of. All these Platonists and Pythagoreans, they are superstitious. They believe in some kind of incorporeal world for which there's no evidence. So that's where he stood. And then how does he ask us to look at the world? Well, you take a phenomenon like heat. If you go back to Aristotle, heat is one of the warmth, is one of the four elements, and you look for the manifestation of warmth here and there. Bacon says this is not the way to do it. You take all the phenomena of heat, and he gives interesting examples. He says the rays of the sun, that gives heat. And then he says there's those flint sparks. That's hot. If it falls in your hand, it's hot. And then there's the interior of animals. That's hot, that's warm. Then nasturtiums, when chewed, give warmth. So he wants to take all the particularities, and then you make a list of them, right? And see, that's all manifestations of heat. And then he says, well, let's look at now other manifestations, similar, but where there's no heat. For example, the moon rays don't give heat, and the star rays, he says. So that's a similar phenomenon to the sun, but different. He said, look at comets. They don't give heat either, apparently. This is his perception, of course. So then you look at the last, that makes a list of these things, and then you end up with a list of things where heat varies. For example, if an animal is in a fever, then the temperature goes up and down, as we know. So it's a varying heat. Now, why is that? And then you see also that when animals work, or human beings, of course, as well, when we work, we get hot. Now, let's look at that as a phenomenon. So you make a list of that. And then out of these lists, you begin to make comparisons. You begin to do his process of induction, drawing from that particular laws. And out of that, you will find a new science. He said as an example, look what's happened in the world, it's changed the world. From the Chinese, we have received the magnet and gunpowder. How would we have created our explorations and changed the world without these two inventions? They didn't come from the professors in the universities. These Aristotelians in Cambridge and Oxford produced nothing. It's the practical people who are engaged in the realities of life who are able to change the world. And he said the printing press, founded by the German Gutenberg in the 15th century, how does that change the world? Again, a very practical discovery, also, by the way, influenced by the Chinese. So that's Bacon. I must stop now because we have to say something about these two. Bacon himself wasn't an experimenter. And the extraordinary thing about him is that he's kind of got a vision of how the world's got to go without having in any way the details of it. He's not the inventor, he's not this new scientist. Gilbert's much more like that than he is, but he's got the vision of the new kind of world that we're going to create. And he wrote a book called The New Atlantis, which is a kind of utopia, which is quite a special thing, but I haven't time to go into that now. Descartes, French, studies law. Both of them are lawyers, actually. We don't have monks now that make philosophers, we've got lawyers. But a man of the world. He has an interest in philosophy, an interest in science, and also he's a soldier. He gets fed up of just sitting around in France, so he joins the army in Holland to fight in the 30 Years' War. And then he doesn't get any posting to the front, as we would say, so he joins the Bavarian army and spends quite a part of his early years, his 20s, as a soldier. And then after in his 30s, he decides he really wants to sit down and think about where he is in the world and how he can understand what the world is. He's a gifted mathematician. He's going to found a new branch in mathematics, which is very important today, and that's the branch of analytical geometry, where you combine algebra and geometry. He's made studies in optics, refraction, and also studied meteors, interested in how something comes from this incorporeal world up there and it's solid earth when it lands here. So he's interested in that. He's written papers on these things. And then he decides that he's going to give himself space, sit down, and think out the basic questions. So he goes to Holland, goes to an inn, books himself in to an inn, and sits, and he describes exactly what's happening to him. So there he is, sitting in the inn, he's in his dressing gown, he's got a table there and some paper and ink. There's a stove burning there, it may have been a bit cold in Holland for him. And he says now, asks himself the question, what can I really say I know? What can I really say that I know I know? And he says, well, I've had dreams, and in these dreams I've dreamt of myself maybe sitting in a dressing gown somewhere. How do I know I'm not dreaming? Could be. And then he even imagines that maybe this world is just created by a malevolent devil and I'm just being deceived about everything. How can I actually say, no, that isn't true? And he even goes to France and says, well, the God even couldn't God deceive us? God is all-powerful. Couldn't he be deceiving us? So he puts that question and says, all these things out there I can't be sure about. I really can't be sure about anything out there. But there's one thing I can be sure about. There is a thinking going on. I am thinking. That's the only thing I can be sure about. I'm not even sure about my own body. But I'm sure that I'm thinking. I may be mistaken in my thinking. But that doesn't take away from me the fact that I'm thinking. And so he starts from that point that there's a thinking substance in the world which is there. I can confirm that. And so he feels assured that he's found a point in the universe from which he can build security about his knowledge. It has to start from there. So he's starting from a very subjective experience. He's not looking at the world because he doesn't trust that looking at the world yet. Now he convinced himself that there is a thinking ego, a thinking self. Where does he go from there? And it's interesting, the path he makes. And this is followed through in 6 meditations he wrote about his experience. The second meditation deals with how he is convinced of the reality of God. And he gives evidence of this, which goes back actually hundreds of years to an Archbishop of Canterbury here actually, who gave a proof of God. It's called the ontological proof. What it basically means is that I, as a human being, am aware of imperfections. There can only be imperfections in the world if there is the idea of perfection, and the idea of perfection itself is imperfect unless there's reality of perfection. And that reality I call God. That's called the ontological proof. It may not convince you. It didn't convince Thomas Aquinas. He wasn't persuaded by that one. But Descartes brings this up, and now he says, quite astonishing really, he says, I'm more convinced of the reality of the infinite than I am of my own finite self. In my feeling of what I know, I can be more certain of the reality of the divine than of my own reality. And that's where he started, with conviction of the reality of his own thinking. And now he said, such a perfect being can't be a deceiver. Consequently, my experience that my ideas come from the world that surrounds me must not be put there by a deceiver. There must therefore be a correspondence between what goes on in my thinking ego and what is out there. But he's divided the world into 2 very distinct experiences, what he calls the mind and what he calls the extended world. He is a man of, not only a man of action, but a thinker who's developed new techniques for handling that external world, like the analytical geometry. For him, you see, there is a huge divide between this thinking world and this world of what we call the world of experience, body and all that. There's a gulf there. And that gulf is bridged because there is a correspondence. The sign of that is it's all created by a non-deceiving God. I see manifestly that there is more reality in the infinite substance than in the finite. And hence I have in me, in some way, the notion of the infinite before that of the finite. That is to say, the notion of God before that of myself. For how would it be possible for me to know that I doubt and desire, that is to say, that I lack something and am not all perfect, if I did not have in me any idea of a more perfect being than myself, by comparison with which I know the deficiencies of my nature? It is certain that I no less find the idea of God in me, that is to say, the idea of a supremely perfect being, than that of any mathematical or geometrical figure. So the geometer is the mathematician in Descartes, is accustomed to evolving thoughts entirely separate from the sense world. You don't evolve geometrical thoughts by looking at circles and so on. As I've said, that's entirely a mental experience. And so he's convinced that this mental experience that asserts the reality of the infinite and of God is more real than the experience he has when he's deducing truths from geometry. You can see that mathematics plays a very central role in the thinking of Descartes. Living at the same time as Descartes in France was Blaise Pascal, another incredibly interesting character. And he took a very different turn from Descartes, but he was also a scientist and a mathematician. And from both Descartes and Pascal, we have mathematical directions which they founded. Pascal founded the theory of probability. And where would we be without the theory of probability today, calculating our insurance, how old people get and when they die and how many people get cancer and all that stuff. All that goes back to Pascal. And he was calculating something on a gambling. A couple of gamblers came up to him and said, look, Pascal, you're a clever man. You've been gambling. And he said that one who wins 3 card games takes the lot. We were interrupted after the second card game. Why do we share the stakes? So Pascal went up, and theory of probability emerges from that. But Pascal is another soul altogether. But he said, and this really characterizes the time that we've moved from Dante. Pascal wrote all his thoughts, they're called pensées, about 700 or 800 thoughts, which he noted down, and they were published. In one of them he said, the eternal silence of these infinite spaces, as he looked up to the sky, terrifies me. So this is the 17th century where you're moving from that Dante picture of the ingathered leaves and bound in a volume of love, the ingathered leaves of the universe, which he can experience. And now Pascal looks up there and says, these infinite spaces terrify me. So it's the time when Copernicus has already changed the whole picture of the universe, and now people are looking and not seeing quite our infinite space, but the beginning of it. And these thinkers are standing back and looking into themselves and saying, how do we bring about this change? It's got to come from here. It's not going to be given from the outside. And in that sense, Descartes is one of these modern souls, essentially experiencing the isolation of the individual, this extreme sharpness of the ego consciousness, and saying, how do I bring my light onto the world to understand it? And nothing like that is with the Greeks of the medieval period, not even with Augustine. But when he actually gets round to understanding the world, Descartes says, well, there are 2 fundamental operations of the mind. One he calls intuition, and the other he calls, what we call it too, deduction. Now, by intuition, he means the conception of an unclouded and attentive mind. He's seeing the world out of the ordinary experience of the human being. He's not like Plato or the medievals who are demanding that the individual makes a supreme effort to free himself from certain aspects of the body, of the mind, in order to unite himself with the divine intelligence. That's not Descartes. Descartes, out of our ordinary intelligence, it has to be unclouded, whatever that means. It has to be attentive. But this is the new scientific methodology. An unclouded scientific mind. And then you are grasping the world with that. And it's that really bridges the gulf. The way Descartes thinks is that separating the mind, it's not a mind engaged in bodily activity, it's a mind abstracted from all body. He leaves the possibility that the body itself is just like a machine. It's a mechanism. And knowledge is not grounded in that. He's distanced himself from that. He's made a gulf. And so we can now look at the animal world, the plant world, the human body as a kind of mechanism. And if we carry on our research with this intuitive process of unclouded attentiveness, we will come to knowledge. And of course you see that the whole tendency, which is strengthened later on, to see the world simply as mechanism, which is so foreign to the medieval, is already having its inception. He's laying the groundwork for that. He again is not a materialist, proves gods exist, but his thinking has taken a very particular direction out of this need at that time for the individual to, out of his own forces, find an answer to these questions. And that's very different from Aquinas, who was reading a text. The world's a text. God's the author of that text. I'm trying to read it. What does the lion mean? Very different than the meaning of lion and the meaning of tiger or elephant. They have meaning. And I read that. And for the 17th century, that now changes. Now I'll just say a word about the third one. Spinoza was descended from a Jewish family, Portuguese Jewish, who come to Holland. Many of them had escaped from Spanish persecution. I'm not sure if it was a Murano Jewish family. There were Sephardic Jews, and in Holland they were faithful to the Jewish tradition. He was brought up in a Talmudic school, and yet, at a certain quite early age, he decided that that was not his way. He started making statements which offended his community, and he was actually thrown out of the Jewish community. He gave up whatever possessions he had and dedicated himself to thinking out, starting afresh, like these 17th century philosophers wanted to, start afresh and find a new basis for understanding the world. He's a mathematician. He's interested in a new science, and these are the two foundations for his thinking. But he criticizes both Bacon and Descartes as they don't follow what he sees as the essential way. Spinoza's main book is called Ethics, and it's a very strange book to try and read because it begins with definitions of what is substance, things like that, and what is an attribute, quite abstract terms. He defines them, and almost like a geometrical textbook, he begins to make deductions from his first principles. Logic is an essential aspect of this, of course, like in all mathematics. So he follows that in his thinking, and he says, this is a picture of how it unfolds. There is only one substance. Call it what you like, nature, God. There is only one substance. But there are many particularities, and these are because they have attributes of this substance, the modalities of this substance. We have to understand what is this nature or God, and he makes no distinction. It's important to understand that nature and God for him are the same. And all the many infinite particular beings, like animals, plants, human beings, and so on, are all explained in reference to this unique, infinite substance, God or nature. So for him, the human being is a part of nature, simply a part of nature, because it's a part of God's substance. So he rejects, which comes from, of course, the Jewish tradition, of giving the human being a stewardship role, a special role in nature, where he stands outside in the natural world and has this particular role appointed by the divine and so on, which is perhaps the traditional Christian or Jewish viewpoint. He rejects all that, and he sees the human being simply as a part of nature. He rejects, again, like Descartes, any attempt to anthropomorphize God and have him as a being with a beard and certain garments and so on, painted by Michelangelo or whoever. And he rejects all that because that is just a trap in which the human being is projecting himself, and that's not the reality of God. Finite beings are modifications of God. So every human being is a modification of God. The infinite attributes of God are thought and extension. So that means that the inner world that human beings experience is an attribute of God. The extended world that we see with our senses is also an attribute of God. So there is no gulf to be bridged, as there is with Descartes. He doesn't isolate the ego in its own present, like Descartes in a way does. He sees the whole thing in what we would call a kind of pantheistic world. God and nature are interwoven. We are part of that. God's attributes are our inner world of thought and our outer world of sensibilities. That's all God. So what is the human being to do? We have to work in this world. What's our task? We're just part of God, like the animals. Do we have a task? And for Spinoza, yes, there is a task. And it's the task of the contemplative person. The contemplative person is the task of understanding the nature of the divine and the divine substance, and in what way the whole extended world is simply transformations of, not doing transformation, but modalities of that world, modes of being of that world. And we have to understand that. And then when we understand that, we will more closely unite ourselves with the substance of God. There is no human freedom in Spinoza. It's not our task to decide out of ourselves how we will act in the world and what we will do. Our task is to more and more approximate ourselves with the divine substance. So we become contemplatives. That is the only freedom we have. We are not free agents. It's a very different picture from the picture of the other two. This one is taking hold of the world in his own ego, and he's going to transform it because he wants power over it. That's one way. This one is to understand the world just through this intellectual apparatus that we have, understand it, and realize that is a corresponding world out there that corresponds to my capacity to think. Therefore, the bridge exists. But this one, for Spinoza, is a complete transformation of that into we're living in a divine world, and it's the individual's task is to elevate himself to grasp the nature of that divinity. He was considered an atheist. He was considered someone to be condemned at that time in the 70s. However, people's attitudes have changed. With Spinoza, Goethe had a great respect for Spinoza, and I think it was his feeling for that we are one with nature, that there isn't this Cartesian gulf between the mind and nature, that we are one with nature, and also Hegel and other people. And I think the people who represent what was called the deep green approach to the world today, with all its problems in nature, feel very akin to the philosophy of Spinoza. He's still, in spite of this strange way of presenting his philosophy as a kind of geometrical theorem, is nevertheless has an influence in contemporary world. Well, that's a very brief and perhaps inadequate exposition of these three giants, people of the 17th century. They are the initiators of this new thinking that's going to evolve right up to our own time. As you see from these three, each of them has to stand on his own ground. There's no united world of the world of Dante or Thomas in which they are trying to make sense of. The world is united, but we make sense of it. The world is not even sure it's there. That's where we're starting from. An uncertain world that we must find out where do we grasp it with any kind of certainty. And this at the same time when the new science is taking off. Galileo's experiments with moving objects, and then just after, born a little later than Spinoza, is the great Newton, who's going to give a whole mechanical picture of the universe, which will go on into the 7th, 18th, and 19th century. So that at the same time, you've got these two movements, as it were, this sense of isolation of the ego, and it's got to stand on its own feet and its own ground and find meaning out of itself, and this incredible world that we are exploring and handling and changing and developing and evolving and digging into, of the world of science. There's a huge contrast in that, and the development that's going on now from the 16th, 17th century.
The next episode is on Locke, Berkeley, and Hume.